Hi everyone, welcome to Rewriting Narratives, a podcast series aiming to change the narrative of mental health in Singapore. We believe that through open conversations about mental health with our peers, we can inspire each other to effect change. I'm Ryan, and I'll be your host for this series. For today's episode, our guest will be sharing her experience with anxiety and how she navigated her personal and school life. Without further ado, let me introduce you guys to Callista.
Hi, my name is Callista. I'm a year 3 student at Yale NUS studying psychology and the arts. I used to be self-diagnosed, meaning I knew I had a mental health condition. I knew that I'll have panic attacks, but only after about 3 to 4 years, I got diagnosed officially, actually just last year in about February.
Maybe before we go further into like telling me your journey or how you get diagnosed and whatnot, maybe let's rewind time a bit. Walk us through your mental health journey. So how or when did your anxiety start?
It started when I was 16, I believe. That was in 2015. I think it came with the stress of O-level. I was a very high-performing student at that time. A lot of pressure was put on me to perform well, especially by my parents, my school. Actually, a funny thing that my school did was, you know how you have assembly and then at the end you have announcements? There was suddenly an announcement for a list of secondary 4 students to come out and meet our level head. And this was because these lists of students were the top, I think, 10 or 15 students in our entire batch. And they literally just met us that random morning to tell us, you guys are the top students, you need to do well for the school. It was like maybe a month and a half from O-levels. So yeah, there's just a lot of pressure. But at that time, I didn't know all this. I was like crying a lot. I end up like locking myself in the bathroom for a really long time, for like hour or two. I also wasn't allowed to take naps, so I would try and take naps in the toilet when no one would bother me. So it was a lot of stress. I probably was having some depressive symptoms at that time as well. It's a really low period for me. Most people didn't actually recognize that I was suffering with this, and I myself actually didn't know how to deal with it.
At that point of time, how do you deal with that experience since you don't really know what it is, and since everyone around you, they don't really recognize these symptoms from you at that point in time. So how was that entire experience in secondary school like for you back then?
If I were to look back and do it all over again, I'll definitely do it differently. One of the things that I did, which I wouldn't recommend, I was doing quite well. I probably actually had the potential to just like do decently. I was in a pure science track for physics and chemistry, but because of all the stress and the depressive and anxiety kind of symptoms, I felt that I couldn't do it, and I decided to just drop down to combined science just because I felt like my school, my parents are expecting me to get an A. So instead of growing more, I just went for what would get me an A. That was one of the things that I did. It did help relieve some of the pressure because obviously the content is more manageable compared to pure sciences. Another thing I did, and actually this really helped a lot, and I'm quite thankful that it happened. I applied for the direct poly admission into SP's Diploma Applied Drama and Psychology. When I got successfully admitted into the course, my stress actually went down quite a bit because it felt like I now have a safety blanket that if I fail, there is something there to save me. And I think at that time there were a lot of thoughts of I'm going to fail because I'm constantly being told you cannot fail. So when that happened, I didn't expect it to help so much. I'm really blessed to actually have that safety net to come in and work so well, even though that wasn't even the intention at that time.
Did anything change compared to secondary school when you entered polytechnic?
I think initially when I came in, my symptoms improved, especially after the admission into poly happened. But slowly, because I didn't actually actively do anything about those symptoms, I didn't seek therapy, I didn't process all those emotions that I was facing during that entire year. Eventually, they will come and bite you in the back. I think it was halfway through poly year 1, my symptoms once again started to resurface. But I think what was really different at that time when it came back was that I'm now studying in a course that teaches me about psychology.
Yes.
And while abnormal psychology, or that's what you call learning things about diagnosis and the disorders, even though that wasn't really covered in school, I had friends around me who were interested in that area, who had the knowledge and could see that, hey, this person isn't doing too well. I can offer this piece of advice or these resources for me to get better. And because of that, I actually learned a lot more about what I had. That was, this time around the depressive symptoms aren't resurfacing, but what is resurfacing is the anxiety symptoms. But because of my friends and all the resources that I was given and shared with me, I'm able to actually cope with it a lot better. To even actually recognize when I'm having anxiety, that was a big step that I didn't really have when I was 16.
Anything major that happened or like anything significant that happened that really like made you realize how damaging or how like important it is to get these symptoms to be recognized or go for therapy or whatnot?
In terms of getting therapy, I started it on my own accord after having a personal incident where my friend attempted to take her life. Sometimes there can be very little support from the lecturers because you have a whole system of, it's like a very bureaucratic system where, we can only give this information to the student directly, even though she's not well right now and she would rather hear it from someone else, for example. So there was very little support in the infrastructure, flexibility to give support to students in need. So it was very difficult for me as a friend and a caregiver during that time. That's why in the end I actually had to seek therapy because I felt like my mental health was going down quite a bit from having that lack of support and still dealing with schoolwork in a very unforgiving kind of like school system. The turning point for me to get even more help was when I had a really bad relapse in 2020.
I believe this is where I think quite a lot of people starting to have panic attacks, depressive symptoms because of the pandemic, right? Yeah, so what happened?
But interestingly, or maybe unfortunately, my relapse actually happened right at the start. It was before COVID hit Singapore. So I actually came back from an overseas trip where I had a really long flight back, and I'm quite scared of flying. I'm scared of planes. To be trapped in a piece of metal hurling through the air, that scares me. And I was having an anxiety attack at that time during the whole duration of that very long flight of about 11-12 hours. So I was constantly anxious. But I mean, I've had anxiety attacks before. So when we landed, and for the next few days, I was really on edge. It was almost as if that anxiety attack was radiating out to the next few days. It passed after 3 days, and I had a break from anxiety for about a week. But a week later, the anxiety just came back without any trigger, and that was the first time for me actually to encounter anxiety without a very clear trigger to cause it to start up again. And it was quite a bad relapse in the sense that I would have quite bad panic attacks without any triggers, and my usual coping mechanisms weren't working. Usually I'm able to distract myself and then calm myself down, watching videos and anything calming or breathing, meditation. But those things weren't working. And so that's when I realized, I need to get help because this relapse is very different from whatever I've been experiencing for the past few years. And it's been 5 years of having anxiety at that point. Yeah, so I actually saw a psychiatrist for the first time, and that was when I officially got diagnosed with anxiety disorder.
So I guess like this incident is basically the main trigger what prompted you to actually seek a formal diagnosis lah.
Yeah.
You just now mentioned about having an anxiety relapse. Could you elaborate more about the symptoms you experienced?
Okay, so when my anxiety relapse happened, I had more severe anxiety attacks that I didn't have before. Actually, I think they're considered panic attacks, actually, which are slightly different. So the difference is usually with panic attacks, there's a bit more irrational fears of, like, for example, death and dying, or that something bad will happen, even though nothing is happening around you. So for the first time, I had panic attacks, and I kept having them over the course of about a month. So a month and a half actually. So every other day it ranges from mild panic attacks where I think I'm in danger and something's going to kill me or something's going to happen to me, or severe ones where I remember there was one time I went out to Clementi Mall. I just needed to run some errands, but as I was making my way back, I kept thinking something was going to happen to me. So I just had to hold it all in until I got to my room, and then I just collapsed and had a panic attack. So it was really, really bad. It was my first time having it in my past 5 years of having anxiety. But I think the dangerous one that I really didn't have anything remotely close to before was depersonalization and derealisation. So that basically just means that I felt like everything around me that was happening was a dream and wasn't real. And that feeling was so severe that, like, if I look out of a window, I would feel like nothing is real, and even if I take a step out, for example, nothing will happen. So it felt like I was in a game or a dream state. But that also means that I am a risk to myself, and it was scary for me also to know that consciously that this is real life, but something is telling you that it isn't, because your brain is just so fatigued and so tired from all the anxiety and panic attacks that it kind of shuts down and creates this dream state to cope better. But in the end, knowing that something is wrong causes it to further make it worse, because you know that this isn't a dream state, and you need to consciously be in check of yourself to make sure you don't do anything dangerous.
So apart from your friends, is there any other support network or coping mechanisms that you use to cope with your anxiety?
So for me, dance is one of my biggest coping mechanisms. Recently, actually, I realized if I don't dance, my anxiety might surface. So I try to dance once a week, and in uni, my friends will try and make sure I dance and turn up for our clubs, because they know it's good for me. And I think having people to do that activity together, something that is very therapeutic for me, is even better when there's friends around me to do it. So I mean, with anxiety, when there's a very high emotional turmoil going on, anxiety can trigger with high emotions. So dance has always been a very good output for me to release those emotions and have a space for it to exist, and kind of let it go.
That's actually very interesting. I mean, I wouldn't expect dance to suddenly come up as an answer, as a coping mechanism. But I think maybe one thing I'm also very curious, because your friends are so supportive, right? Did this same group of friends treat you differently after they know about your condition?
Not really. Although I realized I don't think I told many people that I was diagnosed, but they knew I have anxiety symptoms, because I've been quite open with my anxiety symptoms, feeling anxious. I'll tell them I'm feeling anxious, or maybe I'll tell them that I'm a bit too tired because of anxiety, for example. So they knew that I have anxiety even before I was diagnosed.
Did I expect that, honestly speaking?
I think if you're looking at the biggest change that came after diagnosis, I think that would be because after I got diagnosed and went to see my psychiatrist, I did actually get medication for the first time in my entire life of having, or the past 5-6 years of having anxiety. That's the first time I got medication for it, and that was different. I did have friends who were curious about what medication does for me, because there's a lot of stigma surrounding taking meds for your mental health disorders or conditions, because a lot of people think you can get addicted to it, or it makes you change your personality or behavior, things like that. But thankfully I had friends who asked, mostly because they were curious and genuinely wanted to understand what medication is doing for me and how it helps me cope better, rather than, I think meds are a really bad thing to take for your mental health. Actually, what does it do? That kind of thing. Yeah.
I'm so glad to hear that your friends are actually supportive, and I think that's something that you should cherish, definitely. I'm so glad you talked about stigma just now, because I actually have a curious question to ask. As you have mentioned, there's still a stigma associated with getting a formal diagnosis, because they are afraid of prejudice, especially in their school life or work life. They rather not get a diagnosis. I'm curious to hear, what are your views towards getting a diagnosis in Singapore?
When I saw the psychiatrist, I wasn't expecting to get a diagnosis. I mean, at that time, it was a very dire situation for me. I was experiencing symptoms that I haven't experienced before, like dissociation and depersonalisation. In layman's terms, that meant like everything felt very unreal and dreamlike. Life didn't feel very real, but that in turn caused even more severe anxiety and panic attacks. So it was a very vicious cycle for me. I was told, okay, so the psychiatrist is telling me, okay, it's based on what you've told me, I think you do have general anxiety disorder. When I heard that, I felt like, oh wow, everything I've been going through the past 5 years is now very real. Even though it's kind of like a label, it feels like I have more legitimacy to say that I'm really not well at this point of time. If I need an extension, for example, or if I need to skip out on some things, or if I need even more resources, I know where I can get those things because I know what I have now. I think that's the good things with getting a diagnosis in Singapore. But the downsides of getting a diagnosis, with employment in Singapore, people are asked to declare what mental health conditions they have. People are scared to diagnose or disclose these things because they're afraid this will affect their employment. I have heard that people don't disclose even though they have been diagnosed, and you get this not just from your typical mental health conditions of anxiety, depression, etc. You get these also from people who have learning disorders with ADHD, autism, dyslexia. I do know a lot of people who kind of get away with it, even though they know they've been diagnosed, but they're not going to write it down on paper because it's not very clear to people in the mental health community whether is it illegal if I don't disclose. But if I disclose, is there any laws or policies protecting me from if an employer doesn't want to hire me for these reasons? Is there any policy protecting me? There's not a lot of clarity on that. So I think that's the downside of a diagnosis, because suddenly you have a lot of things to worry about that someone with a disorder shouldn't have to worry about.
Did this diagnosis maybe impede your schooling life, or there was literally zero changes?
Thankfully, because of the school that I'm in, at least for Yale and US, because that's where I got diagnosed, I'm very thankful to actually have professors who are usually quite understanding. If I did need an extension, for example, I would usually be able to get it without much issues. So in terms of getting a diagnosis in school, I think actually it's been helpful more often than not. But of course, I can't say for the whole of Singapore, because I also have had experiences where people are not so understanding of your mental health conditions. Sometimes it doesn't come from a perspective of hostility. It comes from just simple lack of understanding or comprehension of what this mental health condition is. By not understanding anxiety, for example, I've had people who think that I can't go out and work in the mental health field, or that if I work in the mental health field, I'm going to get a mental health disorder from the patients that I see, which is completely not true. I've had people come to me saying those things. So of course, I'm thankful that in school people have been mostly very understanding, even the older profs and staff. But I can't say for the wider Singapore, because I think there is still a lot to be done in terms of improving mental health literacy in Singapore. There are people out there who still don't quite understand what mental health conditions are.
That's what we all hope, to have a better support system, especially when, if I want to get a diagnosis, I don't get discriminated for it. But I think maybe for now, there's little we can do. Since you actually have a formal diagnosis, are there any barriers to getting a diagnosis, and what kind of avenues are there available if they were to pursue like professional help?
If you're in university, actually, you should be able to get access to your university clinic. I believe most of the universities in Singapore, whatever clinic that's attached to their school, should have a panel of psychiatrists in their clinic that's covered by the school. My consultation is free, so I just need to pay for medication, which is still subsidized. So if you're in university, make use of that. That's a huge resource that you can tap on. In terms of therapy, there are a few avenues in Singapore for very affordable therapy. A lot of the times your initial mental health conditions might surface when you're studying in school. So for example, one is Clarity Singapore. They're really, really helpful because when I had to, the plans kind of like fell through because of COVID, but when I approached them for therapy, they were very kind to subsidize it a huge amount to allow me to get therapy as a student who isn't earning any money. There's also Chat. They're run by IMH, and they do kind of like consultations rather than therapy. If you compare like a psychologist and a psychiatrist as like the doctors of mental health, Chat works as like the nurses of mental health, in the sense that they can't diagnose or give you therapy, but they can assess your condition and see what might be going on and give some advice. Where can you seek therapy based on your situation? What might you be facing right now? And point you to more resources.
Thank you for sharing all of these avenues. I think it will be really helpful, especially if they are in university and they don't know where to look for it. From your story, I gathered that you actually performed quite well in secondary school and in polytechnic, but ironically because of that, you also kind of downplayed the symptoms that appear. So would you classify yourself as a high-functioning individual? But maybe before that, do you want to explain what high-functioning means in a mental health context?
Sure. So high-functioning would mean that if you have a condition, a mental health condition, and this term is applied to people with, like, for example, autism, can apply to anxiety and depression. Despite having these conditions that affect your quality of life, it isn't very obvious because perhaps, for example, your academic performance is still really good. Or for example, with autism, day-to-day life is still doable and there's not so much with visual red flags that hint to a person that you have this condition. So that's what high functioning means. I would classify myself as high functioning, but I wouldn't say I downplayed my condition. I would say rather than that, because people didn't notice that I was having this condition, I felt that despite my suffering, I couldn't let it show. So I knew that there was something very, very wrong when I started experiencing my symptoms for the first time. But because people viewed me as someone who's performing well in school, I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm super well off, but I do live in a condo, and then at that time, a lot of my friends would say, "Oh, you live in a condo, you're a rich kid." As a very young teen at that time who was experiencing anxiety and depression for the first time, and then hearing those things of you're doing very well in life, that made me feel like I cannot let all those negative things show because I didn't deserve to be suffering because I'm considered doing well in life. I would say that I was definitely high functioning, but I really struggled to keep those symptoms hidden away from everyone else. And that really makes it a very vicious cycle, especially for people who are high functioning and may feel like that because you feel like you need to keep all those symptoms hidden and then you don't get the help you need. But there's no telltale signs that people can see because you are functioning well in life, but you definitely do need help. When I received my O-level results and I actually did well, both my anxiety and depression really acted up at that time, because even though I did well, everyone around me felt like, that's expected. But to me, it felt like I have just overcome this huge hurdle or obstacle in my life, and I went through a lot of suffering to get to this point. But no one could see that. And I think that can be very discouraging for a lot of people who are high functioning but are suffering with any mental health conditions, because people might not acknowledge that they have overcome something very big in their life because it's not very obvious. So that'll be one of the challenges, I think, to really receive support from the people around them. It's always nice to receive acknowledgement and affirmations that, you did well because you were suffering so much at that time and you still managed to do it. Another thing is actually being able to find people, or rather that feeling safe enough to reveal that even though you're doing well in life in other aspects, mentally you're not doing well. As a 16-year-old with friends who were still young and immature, and that's fine, being in a system that doesn't educate the youths about mental health conditions and that you can be mentally unwell even though you're performing well. I didn't feel like I had a friend who I felt safe enough with to even reveal that I was mentally suffering. So I think that's another challenge, to be able to find someone who you're safe with, because it definitely wouldn't seem like that to them.
Thank you so much for like sharing not only just your story but also advice for youths who perhaps are struggling but they have to keep everything hidden with how our society being so competitive at all. I think that trait is really prominent. Before we end this episode, are there any words of encouragement or advice you want to share?
If you know you have friends who care about you deeply, sometimes your mental health conditions might make it feel like suddenly, especially like for example for me who has anxiety, I would overthink things and suddenly feel like, nah, my friends won't care about this or they won't believe me. But I would recommend take a chance on those friends that have been there with you and open up to them if you are struggling, because even though in Singapore literacy isn't high, as long as you have a friend who is willing to try to understand what you're going through, I think that's a potential source of support. Your mental health condition might tell you you shouldn't do it, but you always deserve to seek help for yourself and get support from the people around.
Callista, thank you for being brave to come forward to share your story. I'm sure your story will inspire others and guide them to the proper avenues when seeking help. Once again, thanks for tuning into our podcast, and we shall see you next time.